Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. He blasted rocks to make money. He collected cars like they were trophies. And he turned a junkyard in the Canadian countryside into one of Netflix's favorite restoration shows. Mike Hall, Rust Valley's own Rasta Blasta, won fans over because he followed his dreams with everything he had, even when the money never worked out for him. But while we watched the fun of bringing old cars back to life, Mike was secretly dealing with stress, growing bills, and the hard truth of running a dream like a business. So when he suddenly held a huge auction and sold hundreds of cars, fans everywhere were left asking the same thing. What happened to Mike Hall? Why walk away from the very thing that made him who he is? Stay tuned to find out. Mike Hall, famously known as the Rasta Blasta, was the kind of guy who lived life at full speed both at work and at home. Born in 1956 in St. Boniface, Manitoba, Canada, Mike's early years were pretty normal until his dad got a job with the Canadian Pacific Railway. That move took the family west to Kamloops, British Columbia, where Mike's lifelong love for cars began to take shape. From a young age, he was hooked. By the time he turned 20, he was already collecting cars, especially muscle cars, the kind that roared and rumbled like nothing else. He often said his love for them was in his blood. Growing up in the 1960s, surrounded by that raw power and style, he became addicted to the thrill of fast cars, a passion that would stick with him for life. When Mike went out on his own, he didn't jump straight into the car world. Instead, he started a company called Chimera Springs Rockworks Limited, where he became known as a rock blaster. It was dangerous, high adrenaline work, exactly the kind of challenge Meek loved. His job was all about drilling, scaling, and blasting rocks to make steep slopes safe, especially along dangerous stretches of road where landslides could mean disaster. As Mike liked to say, he spent years hanging from cliffs and blowing things up. The company did great, and Mike made a good amount of money in the construction business, but anyone who knew him also knew exactly where a lot of that money went, straight into his ever-growing collection of vintage and muscle cars. While he was out on the road blasting rocks for Chimera Springs Rockworks, his jobs took him all over British Columbia. And in every small town or hidden back road Heavisighted, he'd spot some old forgotten car that most people would drive past without even noticing, but not Mike. To him, every rusted shell was a sleeping beauty, just waiting for its second chance. He was away from home about 10 months a year, and with the kind of money he was making, he didn't think twice about buying cars wherever he found them. Getting them home was another story. Sometimes he'd haul them back on trailers. Other times he'd squeeze them into dump trucks or use whatever vehicle could get the job done. That spark for collecting actually began long before his blasting career back when he was just a kid in Kamloops. As the years rolled on, that hobby turned into something much bigger. Mike's collection grew so fast he eventually bought a 26-acre farm just to store his ever-growing fleet. Before long, hundreds of old cars and trucks filled the land like a graveyard of Canadian car history. But even the most patient wife has limits. His wife finally told him the farm couldn't be used as a car yard anymore. So Mike came up with a plan. He bought a 5-acre property in Tappen, perfectly zoned for car wrecking, and set up shop right next to the White Post Auto Museum. He even made a deal to store some of his vehicles on their museum grounds. It was a car collector's dream setup and a perfect excuse to keep buying. Over the decades, his collection grew to nearly 400 cars. What started with a handful in his 20s turned into hundreds by his 60s. He joked that it was an addiction, one that kept getting harder to manage. At some point, Mike began wondering what would happen to it all when he was gone. With his father having died at 60, and many of his friends facing health issues, he realized his own time might be limited. The question hit hard. What would his wife and kids do with 400 cars sitting in a field? That thought pushed him to act. In 2016, he listed the entire property, cars included, for $1.19 million. But surprisingly, no one bought it. A year later, frustrated but not giving up, he raised the price to $1.45 million. And honestly, the offer was more than fair. The deal included the 5-acre property already zoned for car salvage, plus a renovated home, a 900-square-foot restoration shop, and a larger 200-square-foot steel building. He even threw in enough steel beams and rafters to build another 8,000 square feet of covered workspace. And of course, there were the cars. More than 340 classic vehicles, each worth anywhere from a few hundred to tens of thousands. He couldn't even say for sure how many there were. Since first listing the property, he'd added at least 40 more. They lined the fields like a crowd frozen in time, quiet and weathered, waiting for someone to bring them roaring back to life. When asked why he was letting it all go, Mike gave a simple reason. He had planned to restore them all in retirement, but life had other ideas. A massive 5-year rock scaling contract landed in his lap, pushing retirement even further down the road. And at 60 years old, he knew the clock wasn't exactly on his side. Rebuilding all those cars just wasn't realistic anymore. Selling the property, though, turned out to be its own challenge. Winter buried the yard under 6 feet of snow, and buyers weren't exactly lining up to dig through a frozen sea of old metal. But his real estate agent, Hudson Perber from Century 21 Desert Hills Realty, never lost hope. To him, this wasn't just a sale. It was a rare chance for someone to step into a dream surrounded by history in one of the most beautiful corners of British Columbia. Eventually, the story began spreading like wildfire. Headlines popped up about an older Canadian man selling hundreds of classic cars along with his land. Collectors from around the world took notice. Individual carriers started rolling in, and soon television producers caught wind of their story. You see, Mike had already appeared on the hit Canadian series Highway Through Hell, where he'd shown off his blasting skills by clearing dangerous boulders off the roads. The director of that show, Matt Shuchuk, remembered him well. So when news started spreading about a wild car collector in British Columbia trying to sell a property filled with hundreds of vintage vehicles, Matt immediately thought of Mike. He, along with fellow producer Tyson Hepburn, both from Mayhem Entertainment, saw a golden opportunity. Mayhem was already known for creating some of Canada's most successful factual TV series, and Mike's quirky charm practically screamed television gold. Matt reached out and pitched the idea straight. They wanted to build a show entirely around Mike, his cars, and his world in Tappen. At that point, Mike had been struggling to sell his property. Some say he agreed to the show simply because it gave him a new way to make use of what he already had. Others believe it was the perfect excuse not to sell at all. Either way, the timing couldn't have been better. The deal offered him a chance to do what hell of it, restore cars and get paid for it. They filmed a pilot episode, and it didn't take long to impress the big players. Chorus Entertainment jumped on board almost immediately, ordering a full 8-part series. The show would spotlight not just Mike and his team, but also the vibrant, tight-knit car culture of the Shuswap region. Throttle was Rust Valley Restorers, a joint production between Mayhem Entertainment and Big Time Decent Productions. In Cats, it premiered on December 6, 2018. And right from the start, it struck a chord with audiences. Viewers couldn't get enough of Mike's energy. With his wild dreadlocks, larger-than-life personality, and unshakable passion for cars, he stood out from the usual reality TV crowd. He wasn't just another mechanic. He was a character, someone who loved every beat-up old car like it was family. His determination, even when it clashed with common sense or profit, made for addictive television. But there's the thing. By the time Mike Hall started filming the very first season of Rust Valley Restorers, he was already in his 60s. He knew the clock was ticking, and those hundreds of classic cars scattered across his property weren't getting any younger. Each one had the potential to be worth a fortune if restored, but only if he took action. So instead of watching them slowly fall apart, Mike made a bold move. He turned his lifelong passion into a real business. That's how Rust Brothers was born. Now, at first glance, it might sound like just another car restoration shop, but Mike and his crew had a different vision. They weren't chasing high-end showpieces or million-dollar collector cars. Their goal was to bring back vehicles that regular folks could afford. Cars that people could actually drive and enjoy. Of course, that kind of mission wasn't exactly a recipe for easy profit. But Mike didn't care. He called up his closest friends and local car enthusiasts, people who shared his obsession, and together they got to work. The shop itself sat in a place Mike nicknamed his Field of Dreams, tucked between the Rocky Mountains and the desert, a spot known to locals as Rust Valley. It was a car lover's paradise and the perfect backdrop for the show. Each episode followed Mike, his best friend Avery Schoaf, and his son Connor Hall as they hunted through Thayard for their next project. Mike often teased Avery, calling him the muscle car expert of the team, and for good reason. The man could tear down and rebuild a vintage car faster than most people could change their oil. Alongside their own finds, the team also restored vehicles for other classic car owners, keeping their hands and their schedules constantly full. But here's where things got tricky. Mike was used to doing big restorations with no budget limits. Running a tight, cost-conscious shop was new territory. As a result, he quickly found himself overspending on almost every project. Despite the show's growing popularity, The business side of things wasn't going so smoothly. He admitted that he was losing money on most of his builds, saying he'd only ever broken even on 2 cars. Take the 1966 Lincoln Continental, for example. The plan was to keep the restoration under $15,000 and flip it for a profit, but costs spiraled way beyond that. And when the car was finally ready, finding a buyer willing to pay the right price was almost impossible. The same story repeated itself with his beloved Chevelle SS396. Mike had hoped for $25,000, but had to settle for just $10,000, barely enough to keep the lights on. And while Mike was driven by passion, his son Connor was all about practicality. Connor constantly reminded his dad that every dollar spent had to make sense. He wasn't shy about pointing out bad decisions either, like when Mike dropped $2,000 on a metal forming brake just for that same Lincoln. In the end, it was Connor who pushed to sell the car at a loss, arguing that it was better to move on than to sink even deeper. Then came the own of their toughest builds yet, a 1963 Continental convertible. What was supposed to be a $17,000 restoration ended up costing a staggering $50,000, Mike explained it best. Filming a reality show slows everything down. With cameras around, production takes longer, mistakes cost more, and efficiency goes out the window. He estimated that the extra time and effort added about 30% more to every project, a loss he personally absorbed. But he didn't mind too much. He loved making people's dreams come true, even if it cost him. For Mike, one of the biggest challenges in running the business was the constant tension between estimates and quotes. An estimate was a rough guess, but a quote was a promise. And when costs shot past those promised numbers, things got heated. That financial strain and thestress it caused between Mike, Avery, and Connor became one of the most authentic parts of the show. Avery often said the drama wasn't staged. It was just real life in the Rust Brothers garage. Filming only added to the pressure. Working with cameras in his face wasn't easy, and Mike admitted it slowed everything down even more. But the toughest part for him wasn't the long hours or the costs. It was saying goodbye to the cars. After pouring so much heart into bringing them back to life, selling them off always hit him the hardest. That's where Avery and Connor had to step in. They were the voices of reason, the ones who kept Mike grounded and made sure the business actually stayed alive, even when it meant pushing him to part with a car he loved. Yet somehow, Mike's already massive collection of rusted classics just kept on growing. What started as lowly 400 vehicles eventually grew to around 550 by 2021. That's when Mike finally made one of the toughest decisions of his life. He chose to auction off his entire collection. It wasn't because he wanted to, but because he had run out of time, space, and energy to keep them all. He had already sold the land where the cars were stored, and if he didn't act fast, many of them would have ended up crushed for scrap. His family had been encouraging this move for a while, especially his son Connor, who worked alongside him restoring vintage cars. Connor explained that they'd been pushing Mike to hold an auction the year before, but he just wasn't ready to let go. This time, though, he finally accepted that it was time to move on. For car lovers everywhere, this was incredible news. Fans who'd been following Mike's journey since the show's debut in 2018 finally had a chance to own a piece of his legendary Field of Dreams. The auction was organised by Alberta-based EGA Auctions, also known as the Electric Garage, and it was shaping up to be huge. They planned to live stream the entire event, attracting bidders not only from Canada but from around the world. By the eve of the auction, more than 7,000 online bidders had already registered. Every single one of the 500 vehicles was listed with no reserve, meaning whoever made the highest bid, no matter the amount, would take it home. Among the sea of project cars and parts vehicles were 3 special rides fully restored by Mike and his Rust Valley team. A 1970 Chevrolet Camaro, a 1955 Chevy 2-door station wagon, and a 1970 Chevy K5 Blazer. The event, however, wasn't your average auction. According to EG Auction CEO Todd Schwint, it was their biggest logistical challenge yet. Normally, cars are moved into an auction hall, but not this time. The vehicles would stay right where they were, scattered across Mike's property. The auctioneer and team would have to move from car to car, turning the entire field into one massive open-air event. As the countdown to auction day began, Mike kept himself busy with one final project, a restoration for a client's 1964 Pontiac. The owners wanted something elegant but still fun, a car they could enjoy with their kids. They needed a third-row seat, which sent Mike digging through his mental catalogue of car parts. He remembered a fellow collector who owned a station wagon with the exact seat he needed. A quick trade later, and the project was wrapped up just in time. The family was thrilled, and for Mike, it was a satisfying way to close a chapter. But as the night before, the auction rolled in, the weight of it all hit him. At 8:00 p.m., Todd called to share some exciting news. They had already broken their record for registered bidders. Still, Mike couldn't relax. He lay awake that night, his mind racing, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. He was gambling his entire legacy on this one event, and he knew it. Adding to the tension was the fact that Mike had never even attended an auction before. He didn't know what to expect. And since there were no reserve prices, there was a real chance his prized cars could sell for next to nothing. His worst fear, that one of his closest friends might end up walking away with one of his favorite cars for a handful of dollars. When the big day finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric but heavy. Mike struggled deeply with the idea of saying goodbye to his field of dreams. Todd and the EG Auctions crew did everything they could to keep things organized, cleaning up the yard and setting up a smooth system for buyers to bros bid and pay. But when it came time to face the moment, Mike froze. Connor and Avery had to practically drag him to the auction site. Walking through the rows of cars he'd spent decades collecting, Mike felt overwhelmed, his heart pounding, his stomach in knots. The sound of the auctioneer's voice echoing across the yard hit him hard. Thankfully, Connor and Avery stayed by his side the whole time, reminding him that letting go wasn't losing. It was the start of something new. When the auction finally went live, the excitement was off the charts. Around 700 online buyers were tuned in,